Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are economists, scientists, politicians, academics, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, ecological, and political crises that we face today, and they reveal their solutions to mitigate the damage to our future. This is a critical time for our planet. It demands critical thinking. Click the subscribe button now and go to planetcritical.com to learn more. My guest this week is system scientist George Mobus. George is a computer scientist by training who did some fascinating work with AI that he explains at the beginning before heading into the field of system science. He joined me to discuss what research in system science is currently missing, the essential nature of the global problematique, how him and some of his colleagues are attempting to create a vast global model to understand the polycrisis, how economy, human organization, energy, climate all fit together to drive this very unstable phase of human history. He also goes into a lot of detail about the development of the brain, has some very interesting theories as to how the systems that we've created have impacted our human behavior and our capacity for what he calls wisdom. And of course, from all of that, we end up in a conversation about societal collapse. So there's lots to learn in this one. I really hope you all enjoy it. If you do, please share it with your network. If you love the episode, support the podcast on Patreon. The link is in the description box below. And to those of you already supporting this podcast and my work, thank you so much. Well, George, thank you very much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Good to be here.
Could you give a little walkthrough of your fields of research and your academic career? And then we'll go from there.
Yeah, it's kind of a long story, so I'll try to shorten it up as much as possible. I started out in biology many, many years ago. Got my undergraduate degree at the University of Washington, Seattle. And over the years, I jumped around a little bit. There weren't many jobs for zoologists when I graduated. So I ended up in the business world and then basically got myself an MBA. And that's where I was first, had my first real exposure to what I now know as system science. Pardon me. Then after a number of years of doing that, I ended up as the CEO of a small company near San Diego. But I found it boring as dickens. So again, long story short, I finally ended up at the University of North Texas to get a PhD in computer science. All the while, I was building and building and building my understanding of general system science. And there's only one university in the United States that actually has a true system science program, and it's very limited.
Okay. Sorry, is that still true today?
Yeah. It's
Right.
in fact, that program has gotten smaller since. But in any case, I just basically gathered as much information as I could, and I used it. Actually, in my computer science PhD dissertation, I developed a robot, an autonomous agent that emulated the way a snail brain works, so that the robot could wander around in its environment, which we changed up. We changed the configuration, and it had to learn which kinds of things it should approach and which kinds of things it should avoid. So in that process, I really did apply a great deal of systems theory to figuring out how I was going to do this. So it's completely different from standard AI. In standard AI, it's basically pattern recognition. When I say standard AI today, that includes neural networks. But the neural network I built was based on trying to emulate real neurons and not just these, quick and dirty neurons.
Can you explicate that a little further for me? How pattern recognition would be different then to programming this systems-based snail brain model? Because to me,
Right.
it seems, if there's an environment and it has to learn where it can go and whatever, why would that not be pattern recognition?
Uh, well, pattern recognition is an important part of intelligence. That's for sure. But and so you have to go through the process of learning the patterns. But in this case, I integrated all of the control circuitry into the same neurons that were learning the relations, um, yeah, the relations. I'm trying to get the right word. Um, but in any case, it's sort of irrelevant here. Um, so it was really a very, very compact circuit that I developed. And what's going on is I'm simulating the way the real neurons, those biological neurons, work in terms of adjusting their synaptic weights, as opposed to the way it's done in a typical artificial neural network, where they're using what's called supervised learning. They're using yep, this is the pattern we want you to see. What do you see? Kind of thing, and
Okay.
then allow that to adjust the weights. Um, so basically, I mean, what I'm saying is I was trying to follow the animal pattern,
Mm.
animal way of doing this, and getting some additional capabilities. So pattern recognition does not involve reasoning, for example. So people for years have been trying to combine more traditional AI, which involves reasoning, with the pattern recognition of artificial neural networks. I don't think there's been a whole lot of success doing that. In the meantime, another group of people have realized that probably if you're going to get brain-like behavior, you're going to have to emulate the brain. So they're
Mm.
doing research on actually doing essentially what I did, but for a human brain. And I look for that to produce some interesting results.
Why do you think that, and we might be sort of vaguely going off topic already, but why do you think that artificial intelligence went for, or like that field went for the pattern recognition um, model rather than the systems model? Is it because the systems model is much more complex and demands a certain, being able to program a certain level of reasoning?
Yeah, I was in San Diego at the time that the backpropagation learning algorithm was first being employed. And I went to a number of seminars given by the people who were presenting or were developing that. And I've had many discussions with them. Basically, uh, it came out of the cognitive science realm, and basically the people who were involved in it, that's what they understood is pattern recognition. And they also understood from previous work on artificial neural systems that it had something to do with the uh, changing of the synaptic weights between these. Now, what they did was they have basically it's a three layer. Now with deep learning, it's many more layers. They had three layers of artificial neurons, and from each layer in the input side was connected to all the neurons in the second layer, and all of those neurons were connected to all of the
Mm.
neurons in the third layer, the output layer. And they would measure the error between the pattern that was being presented and what it actually was that the neurons output, and fed that back to cause the change in the weights of all these others. Now, the brain, animal brains, human brains don't work that way at all. It's not fully connected. Um, and you may have heard that in these artificial neural networks, that it takes quite a long time to train them. They have to
Mhm.
go through a huge training set of patterns. to learn to distinguish them for what they are and so forth. Whereas an animal like a snail or a human can learn, instantly. Um, so there's just vast differences between the way they work and the way they encode information, store knowledge, and so on and so forth. I don't know. It was pretty successful. The only problem was I've had people say, "Oh, that's really interesting work. I wish I understood it." So I did continue doing research in my early professor years. Um, but after a while, like I say, people would look at it and say, "Well, we can do all of that with this artificial neural network. It's really easy to program." Um, so I just basically at some point said, "Well, you know what? Let me turn my full attention to system science because
Mm,
I really see that as being applicable to human organizations, um, to any system and the Earth as a whole, actually."
mhm.
And that's what I've been doing ever since then.
Why do you think that system science is such a sort of undersubscribed field? I mean, it's been 50 years since Limits to Growth, which was kind of such an inaugural important piece of system science, especially as it pertained to the climate crisis and the urgency of the situation. The more I learn about it, the more it seems just so fundamental uh, to understand systems and be able to create models around them. And yet, it's just not something that we uh, hear about very often. It's not something that we see, certainly at the political level. Why do you think that is? Is it because of the complexity of the field?
Yeah. Well, there is a complexity involvement. First off, almost everybody actually has the basis for understanding systemness, the properties of being a system. The thing that it's a bunch of components that are connected together, they operate together, and they have less of an interaction with the external environment than they have with one another. So that part's pretty easy. You get into the details though, and it starts to get really complex. But the other reason is exactly what you mentioned. So you talk about Donella Meadows' um, work, and that is based on a modeling method called the systems dynamics modeling, a very specific kind of approach. And that actually turns out to be, and people specialize in it. They limit themselves to that aspect alone. Unfortunately, that's only one aspect of total systemness.
Right.
The dynamical properties of the system, how it behaves. That's just one aspect. Structural elements have to be taken into consideration. Let's see. Well, there's quite a number. The every system is organized as a kind of a hierarchy
Hmm.
of subsystems. So people began specializing. You had people specializing in cybernetics, for example, especially the management science folks. People specializing in complexity and so forth. So each of these areas, which are collectively and integrated aspects of being a system, just sort of, we have a tradition of being specialists,
Mm.
of focusing in on one area and trying to develop as much as we can about that. Nothing terribly wrong with that, uh, unless in this case, you don't go back and say, how does that fit in with everything else? And that's what people are failing to do. So, one of my colleagues and I, Mike Colton, a number of years back, decided to write it's I call it a guidebook. It's not actually a textbook, um, on the principles of system science. So it basically has chapters for all of these different aspects and shows how they interrelate with one another. Um, and that has actually become quite popular. Every once in a while I check the sales stats, and it was released in 2015. And basically, it's still selling. I get more citations from that book than in my entire academic career for computer science. So it's been holding up very well. And then more recently, I just wrote a book myself that is called System Science Theory, Analysis, Modeling, and Design. So I cover the sort of the four major activities, if you will, within the system sciences. And again, I integrate all of these different aspects to show how they have to go together in order for you to actually fully understand a system.
It would,
And
sorry, but it would just seem quite ironic that system science would be yet another field that was siloed into its different separate parts rather than coming at it from an integral perspective.
I think that's a human failing, if you will, a human part of our human condition. I mean, I get people saying, "Well, I'm glad you wrote the book, but I'm still a cybernetician, right?
Mm.
I'm still a complexity person
Hmm.
because in the end, it really is hard to look at all of those, especially simultaneously. You have to
So,
parse through when you analyze the system. You have to literally take it apart and see all the parts and take into account, for example, networking. Everything is a network. All systems are networks of components. Some of those components are directly interacting with each other. Others are more distantly interacting through other components. But it is a network. And so you have to apply network analysis to the structural aspects of it. Well, structural and dynamical, because links will change over time, just like the brain, just like a neural network. It is capable of adapting and even evolving.
so when we take the field of system science as it is today and we apply it to the climate crisis, what are some of the major failings, in your opinion, that are happening within the field? What are the parts that we're missing, or what if are there blind spots, and what effect are they having on the climate conversation?
Well, yeah, again, this is going to be a more macro view than you might be thinking about. The climate situation is a result.
Hmm.
It's a symptom of something that's going on much deeper. Namely, as we know, it's because we're pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Well, why are we pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? It's because you and I need to get in our car and go to the store.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm not, I don't live near, I just bought an electric bike. So hopefully I'll be changing some of my carbon footprint. Um, and then why is it that we're burning gasoline, uh, or oil products, in order to achieve this? And that turns out to be a matter of we're in a hurry. We want to get places fast. We want to cook our meals quickly. We want to do a variety of things, and we want it to be so these are all things that we just don't often take into account. We know we're responsible. We don't know why necessarily we're responsible. And people studying climate, um, they keep saying we've got to stop pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. If we don't do that by a certain date, game over. Um, why don't people do it? We've all heard that message. We've all heard that it's this is what's going to be necessary. Yet, I I'm guessing you, but I could be wrong. And so many other people still live comfortable lives. We still have tomatoes shipped up from Mexico in the dead of winter, um, in the U.S. here. So we have to address what is it about us that makes us incapable of relinquishing all these comforts and so forth.
Well, Surely that in itself, though, is a systems problem because it's not as simple as just stopping pumping carbon dioxide overnight. It's the fact
Right.
that that is part of our economic system and our energy system, and that's having an effect on our ecology. There are
Exactly.
multiple levers that need to be pulled at the same time in order to facilitate an energy transition, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly the point. You can't just look at the climate and say, well, all we need to do is put some big direct air capture machines out there around the world and we'll solve that problem. But we can continue to go on driving our cars.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it is. That's why I say the whole world is a system.
Hmm.
The human social system is a subsystem of the entire world.
Hmm.
Uh, it evolved from that world.
So I'm just wondering if we can tie this into what you were saying about AI at the beginning. It's really pricked my ears up, and I'm wondering, is there a the decision that was kind of taken to focus on pattern recognition because it's perhaps more feasible? Um, is that going to have a limiting effect on what we will be able to ask, artificial intelligence help with in the future? Because I think also one of the techno optimist perspectives is that we're eventually going to code an AI that is so powerful, we're going to be able to feed models in and get data and results really, really quickly. And from that, figure out what to do. And yet, if AIs are being programmed sort of without reasoning, as you put it, and I'm sure I'm paraphrasing here, I'm not a computer scientist or a scientist, is that going to inhibit what our technological pals could help us with in the future?
Well, I never bought into that story. I thought AI was a useful tool, and it is a useful tool when you apply it in the right place. But as it stands right now, and the kind of thinking that people are doing going into that, they want it to be a technological solution. I mean, we invent stuff, no question about it. But is that going to be the ultimate answer for us in the end? Now, having delved into how the brain works and pretty deeply, um, it's vastly more complex than any deep learning AI that we've got yet. And that's why I say there are people. Pardon me, IBM has a project going. We got one here in Seattle, uh, where they literally are trying to emulate what the brain does and how it does it, because they realize it's going to take that kind of approach. They might succeed someday, and as my oldest son likes to say, I for one look forward to the day when our um, machine overlords take over and keep us from destroying the rest of the earth. But
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to happen. Certainly, no time soon. And we may have a civilizational collapse that will prevent it from ever happening.
I wonder if people would accept directives better from an artificial intelligence than from a human leader, like a politician. Like if we had a great big machine that was seen as the most intelligent thing on the planet, and it said, "Yeah, you really need to stop burning CO2." I wonder then if the message would go through.
I don't know. The answer is 42. Of course, you know that.
Yeah. The answer is always 42. All right. So we can't look to AI then. What interesting developments are happening in system science at the moment that you think will be able to better tackle these sort of big existential questions and questions of complexity?
Um, well, actually, it's interesting you asked because that's what we're going to be dealing with at our conference in July.
Hmm.
We've been building up by uh, having speakers come in who understand various areas of and sometimes the whole what's called the global problematique, because it isn't just climate, it isn't
Hmm.
ocean acidification, it isn't sea level rise, it isn't freshwater loss, soil loss. It's all of these things combined, and they're all due to the same underlying force, namely human consumption
Hmm.
and human growth, right? It's the population growth. So we have to tackle those directly, and we have to have a giant model, if you will, of how all those things interact with one another.
Hmm.
And we have built, I mean, the various sciences have built up a considerable amount of knowledge how each of the dynamics behind each and every one of these things. So the probably the knowledge is there. We just have to figure out how to attack it. Um, and I think the International Society for System Science is probably a pretty good place to try to organize that.
How close are you to creating the giant model?
Well, I'm not close at all. I mean, I've got a pretty good understanding in my head of what all these pieces are and how they would need to be put together. But it's going to take a team of people and some modeling tools to be able to do that. I in the new book that I just put out, I do address bits and pieces, the economy, um, you know, resource depletion,
Mhm.
things of that nature, to show how they systemically interact. But um, it's not going to be done by one person.
Is there a limit to what we're neurologically capable of in terms of dealing with complexity?
Individually, almost certainly.
Hmm.
Collectively, if we can figure out what an ideal social organization looks like for human beings, which brings out the best in them, allows them to gain and use wisdom, and and doesn't bombard them constantly with pressures from jobs or whatever. Um, yes, I think a group, not even a very large group of humans, could organize to become collectively conscious and collectively able to work on these problems. They do it by sharing.
Mm.
They share what they understand with others, and uh, but we have to overcome some fundamental, I don't know, issues with human beings as they are, because you can share something and the person receiving it doesn't accept it because they've got their own idea about what things are. They're
Mm.
anxious to share with you, and so somehow or another we've got to break down the communication barrier. We're also going to be exploring that possibility at the conference as well. We've got a former president of the society who's been working on a dialogic mechanism for groups to work together and come to a common understanding. And so hopefully we can, in years to come, put that together and see if it works.
What's the theory behind that as to why human beings sometimes struggle to listen to each other?
Well, for me, it comes down to this notion of wisdom. Um, Several years back, I wrote another book called *Sapiens*. It was the application of systems science to understanding human behavior, and we called ourselves Homo sapiens. Sapiens is Greek for wisdom. So man the wise.
Mm.
I don't think we can look back at all of history and watch the development of what we've been doing the last 10,000 years or so and say we've been particularly wise. As there are individuals here and there who seem to be able to rise to the occasion. I think of Gandhi or Mandela. Um, but the vast majority, I don't think, are there. So I would not call us Homo sapiens. I would call us Homo pseudo sapiens or something like that. Um, and in that book, I explored the brain foundations for. I allow it to be sapiens because we're different from other animals. I mean, we have abstract language and you know can invent things, complex tools, and so forth. So we're clearly different. We passed some kind of a threshold, and uh, however, we're not sufficiently different in the sense that we still rely very heavily on what are called the animal spirits or the limbic system, essentially.
Hmm.
Um, and it can override the prefrontal cortex here, this area, patch of cortex behind the eyebrows is the latest uh, development in brain evolution.
Hmm.
And it grew quite extensively in size and complexity. Um, maybe 500,000, I'm actually forgetting it, 200 to 500,000 years ago.
Hmm.
And, and that seems to be the seat of our capacity to not just reason or think, control our thinking, but actually to integrate with our subconscious capabilities as well as our conscious capabilities, and and learn reality. Um, And so basically, wisdom is just applying what you've learned, whether it's conscious application or intuitions that rise from the subconscious, and then we latch onto them consciously. So yeah, that's a pretty good idea.
Mm.
Um, so anyway, the the gist of the book is that human beings were on that path of evolving more capacity for wisdom. And I suspect, and I argue in the book, that it was the advent of agriculture, which as a means for um, getting food, getting resources, just changed the framework in which we had been evolving for greater wisdom. Um, because the emphasis in agriculture is on tactical and logistical problem solving, very local. And so that would have changed the selective pressures that were on humans to uh, think more strategically. Um, that's putting in a nutshell, but basically is that we just didn't evolve sufficient capacity for exercising wisdom, and that's
That's
where we're stuck.
that's very interesting. So our brain was developing, prefrontal cortex was developing, that capacity for wisdom was emerging. And then, due to how we set up and organized our food systems, with that focus on locality and logistics, what that kind of changed the path that we were on previously, which was more abstract wisdom, to a more concrete and structured, rational relationship to the world.
Well, yes, because as hunter gatherers in small tribes, um, basically you've got a collective decision making process, which is self reinforcing.
Mm,
Uh, Generally, these tribes were they weren't controlled or managed in the sense we think of now, but the wisdom of the elders was definitely a part of that, and these tribes had to really address the whole world that they could have access to.
yeah.
They have to move around, have to have some idea of where they should move. Um, so there was a more strategic requirement in their thinking. And when we settled down into singular places for the entire season and began to focus on the operations of agriculture and uh, building structures and things of this nature, that really put a completely different set of pressures. And so, since the vast majority of people, remember, evolution is based on fitness, and fitness is based on your capacity to reproduce yourself. And since the vast majority of people were engaging more and more in these tactical, logistical, and operational decision processes, they that's where evolution was going to select for. The better they got at doing that, better off the population was. So a few people still had some strategic thinking capability. Well, all people have it. It's just not that well developed. But in some people, it was very well developed, and they tended to move toward leadership and so forth. So that's the short story,
How
but
interesting.
he captured it very well. And
I'm just thinking, so if in hunter-gatherer societies, there had to be an awareness of the bigger picture at all times, because people were moving around, their environment that they had to understand perhaps was like a larger area even than a homestead with a field and a permanent settlement. There had to be an awareness of the different cycles of seasons and where they could get food at different times, and also that process of collaborative decision making as well. It's so interesting to think that um, then decisions would have become slightly more micro when settling. And I'm thinking even of, I can't remember who I was speaking to, it was a few months ago, but they were saying, even pre-industrial agriculture, just 500 years ago, they had better long-term thinking than we did because they understood that you have to store grain in order to sow the field the next year or to, feed yourself over winter, for example. And now we just live in such an on-demand society that we don't have to think long-term really about anything, or haven't
right,
had to in a very long time. And that is why we're sort of fundamentally ill-equipped to deal with a polycrisis like the climate crisis, especially when it is this symptom of different events rather than a singular thing like an asteroid hitting the Earth or whatever. So it's just interesting to think how all of those, how our thinking became increasingly micro, from, as per your theory, that one decision to settle almost. And the siloing of education, the atomization of different fields of study. It's how interesting. And then what that would have done to our brains. So how do we how do we get back to bigger picture thinking?
um, I can't say for sure that it's going to require any kind of evolutionary process. Um, Here's the scenario I'm seeing, and it's not a pretty one. I think society is going to collapse, and the survivors will go back to basically hunter gatherer, or very very. Are you familiar with permaculture? The concept of permaculture?
Vaguely, but could you explain it for the listeners?
Yeah, it's basically it's the application of systems thinking to whole living. It's a small community-based approach to food, shelter, clothing, and so forth, but on a sustainable and self-reliant, shall we say. So it's going back to the tribes of old. And I'm thinking that because the climate is going to be so hectic, that these permaculture communities are probably not going to be able to stay in one place for
Mm.
a multi-year periods. And so they're going to have to go back to this idea of moving around and being aware of the larger picture. Um, so if that happens, maybe 10,000 years from now, um, humans will be back on track in that regard. The other scenario, which is a scary one, and a lot of people are going to think it's pretty scary, is that we do have now technology for actually doing gene editing. And we also have a mapping of the genetics of brain development. So we know exactly which genes, well, we know most. Which genes get turned on during embryology and development phases that that cause the prefrontal cortex to grow the way it grows. Um, and if the hypothesis is right in terms of that's where the center of advanced human sapiens would be, then it is conceivable. I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying it is conceivable that we could literally manufacture some wiser people.
Jeez.
Yeah, I know. Look, we made the decision a long time ago when we put a pointy rock on the end of a stick uh, that this was going to be our fate. We're going to have to figure out how to solve these things through some sort of machination.
I think my gut is just like we would go the other way in terms of the powerful class would manufacture slightly stupider people um in order to get away with making the kind of decisions that they want and not facing public discourse about it.
Yeah, it's like Brave New World.
See, I personally think that that's we're heading more towards a hugely unequal and stratified society, where the whole concept of like the 1% and the elites like still very much sort of live in the shadows currently and are protected by our economic systems and our energy systems and are very much dependence as well on how they've kind of created the world. I think rather than a huge collapse that sees people going to sort of live out these tribal ways of being, I think we're going to see massive population decline through climate events and then uh, bioserfdom, essentially. Uh, yeah.
Now, well, we what we need to do, what system science does teach us, is we need to consider all of these scenarios. What our models should do is generate a number of scenarios, and then we kind of because that allows us to anticipate various changes that will occur and to recognize them when they occur, and then
Mhm.
hopefully be able to mitigate them in some way, shape, or form.
I
So,
get it. Like working backwards almost.
yes, yeah.
Hmm. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I said enough.
I was saying, as you were saying, I was thinking that about how physicists have modeled the Big Bang through this idea of going backwards and looking back through time, essentially. And would it not be possible to envision different scenarios, exactly as you say, and then work backwards and uh, identify the perhaps sociological trigger points? Although I'm not sure what it would change because we have also the planetary boundaries and the warming targets and all this stuff. And we know that we're overshooting and hitting all the trigger points and nothing changes.
Yeah, yeah, that's the unfortunate reality.
When you said that you think that society is going to collapse, you're not the first guest that I've had on this show that says that. Why?
Why is it going to collapse?
Yeah.
Well, it's all of the above, right?
Hmm.
Um, like you said, there'd be population effects on from climate, um, sea level rise. All of those elements of the problematique are going to come to play, and our society is so dependent. The Western society, particularly, I mean, the northern Western societies are so dependent on there being people. I mean, what do we talk about in economics? If we need more people to fill the labor market, we don't have
Mm,
labor.
mm,
Well, at some point, that whole thing is going to break down. All
mm.
of that will be forced to go to uh, self survival essentially.
Are
Have you
there
read?
no go on.
Have you read Joe Tainter's book, Collapse of Complex Societies?
No, but it is on my reading list. And I've been
It's
saying that for too long.
his thinking has evolved a little bit from when he wrote that book, and he's working on a new one, I believe.
Okay.
Um, but basically, he goes into detail on how the complexity itself creates more problems, and at some point, you simply don't have enough energy. And I'm talking about energy like oil or nuclear or whatever. You don't have enough energy to operate the whole thing, and so it just falls in on itself.
Yeah. Yeah. But still, I think something that I'm so interested in with this work that I do is that I speak to people all around the world every week and on Twitter every day, who are actively working on solutions and system solutions, not direct air capture nonsense. Um, and there are huge communities around the world of people really trying to achieve something and coming closer and closer to identifying the macro picture and where the levers are. And I think that yes, not enough is happening on a global political level. The fundamentals, the macro, is very much misunderstood by our political leaders, et cetera, et cetera. But still, it seems to me that there is a network, almost like a neural network of people attempting. And
Mhm.
therefore, that like the more information that I get, the more hopeful I get, even though the picture is still pretty bloody bleak. um,
Yep.
so
Well, I
yeah.
that's great to hear. I've looked at these permaculture communities
Mhm.
all over the world. It started out in Australia, but it's basically they have them everywhere now. And it seems to me that these are people who are they're not trying to solve the big problems. They're simply taking care of their um, uh, their own living by not creating more problems.
Mhm.
And my guess is those we're looking at the survivors, people who will actually be able to get through any major societal collapse. So I'm not talking about everything collapsing. I'm just talking about the standard business as usual economy that is working right now, which is utterly dependent upon um, us burning fossil fuels.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Even if you may already know this, even to put up a single windmill, right? You're going to generate electricity with a single windmill. Takes more in the form of fossil fuel for the concrete, the fiber, what do they call it, the carbon fiber plastics, whatever they make them out of. Um, so it actually costs the carbon footprint of I'm probably going to get this wrong, but the carbon footprint of a single modern windmill is bigger than if you just simply run a gas um, power plant, or maybe not gas, maybe coal. Anyway, the point is it's a zero sum game. Uh, as long as you demand that electricity,
Yeah,
cut back
yeah,
on the electricity, and now you got
yeah.
a solution.
Well, and this is the thing, is there's lots of economic theory being put forward right now, under the umbrella of degrowth about absolute reduction. Absolute reduction in the demands that we put on economy, but also the demands that we put on resources and people. A lot of what you were saying when we went into the wisdom part of this conversation sounded a lot like health, like the health and well-being of human beings, and therefore their capacity to have healthful lives and impact on the planet as well. Like this discourse is now coming into the mainstream. The Spanish minister for consumer affairs wrote an article in one of their national newspapers about degrowth just a few weeks ago. So the collapse of business as usual society, I mean, collapse would be dramatic and violent and awful, and many, many people would die. But like the pressure on it to transform into something new, that would be fantastic. I mean, I think we're all ready to kiss capitalism goodbye, unless you're really rich capitalist.
Well, I certainly hope so. At one time I was a capitalist. Um, I tried to start up, getting venture capital to take my version of neural networks and neural emulation into some kind of a product.
Yeah.
And I was almost successful. Well, I was successful in getting a commitment from venture capital. And then it was 1986, the stock market crash in the
Mm.
United States. I don't know if you
Yeah.
heard about that or know about it. Um, it happened the very day we were supposed to sign the
Oh,
contract.
really?
And so the venture capitalists basically went out of business.
Yeah.
But that saved me. That saved me. It got
Mhm.
me on another path that eventually I got to the point of realizing that, yeah, this just can't go on forever. And I hope you're right. I don't. I talk to probably a more limited number of people than you do, and we're in something of an echo chamber in the society. Um, but there is a recognition there that capitalism is the way it's done now, just can't succeed. So
Absolutely. The one concern I have about the discourse around capitalism is identifying it as purely a system in and of itself that is the problem rather than a manifestation of some problematic part of human behavior. Because if we don't take into account a lot of the things that you were saying, sort of our lack of wisdom over the past 10,000 years, rather than recognizing, it was a mix of new economic system and then access to this incredible energy source which spurred globalization, our capacity to just expand and grow the way that we did. That didn't
right,
just happen because those systems presented themselves. They happen also because of the choices that human beings are making to
right.
develop and cement those systems. So I obviously would like capitalism to go away. But I think we also have to be very aware of what would be coming to replace it as well, and how would like the shadow of capitalism appear in global socialism, for example. We already have examples of that in former socialist revolutions.
Yeah, there's I've made a big deal out of saying I don't like isms anymore. Uh, that because we have this tendency to dichotomize and say capitalism or socialism,
Mm,
and that's driving a lot of politics in the United States right now in nasty, nasty ways. Um, why are there isms? Because people have beliefs
yeah.
about how things should be, how things work, and if we could actually just realize that we're talking about systems and systems of systems
Hmm.
and so forth. And that each of the component parts, like these permaculture communities I'm talking about, are really worth looking into because they offer a promise for a way to live happily, healthily, um, uh, and they can communicate with one another, but that basically um, it's not an ism. There's no they can organize however they want. They don't if they wanna share equally among themselves, they're free to do that. And all the ones that I'm familiar with, they do in fact do that because
Mm.
there's a shared sense of purpose, a shared sense of, uh, you know, what work needs to be done, and, yeah, it can be a pretty complete society into itself, in many ways. I mean, it includes education of the young. Um, are you familiar with the Montessori schools?
Vaguely, yes.
Well, that's another area you might want to explore at some time. They're based on some of the best psychology that was known uh, mid, early to mid 20th century, um, where students learn at their own pace. There aren't
Yeah.
grades in the
Yeah.
ordinary and younger students can learn from older students. And they have various ways of teaching subject matter that are more holistic. Well,
Mm.
my youngest son was went attended a kindergarten kind of Montessori that was on a farm, and it was more like a permaculture farm, but it was just a couple that ran it. So they raised their own food. They had chickens and sheep. And I can't remember what all, but basically it was a very simple lifestyle. Those kids learned to sew, to cook, to do a whole variety of very practical kinds of things, but they understood the connections. Where did the wool come from to make threads
Mm.
and yarn and stuff like that? Well, they could see how these things were cycling around. It was right there in front of them, and I
Mm.
think he got a better education from that experience than he ever would have gotten from. And he continued on in Montessori um, after he graduated from that. But I think that was a very seminal kind of experience. So my contention is um, raise children in a permaculture environment where people are practicing wisely, and they will become very educated in the practical skills. And then when they're, say, early teens, you can start working them on the more academic parts of things, like take them from arithmetic to higher forms of math. So they'll be better prepared for learning.
This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
Yeah. Well, my informal colleague, Tyler Volk, has written a number of books. He's a planetary scientist, so to speak. He did a lot of work on the carbon cycle.
Okay.
His most recent book is called Quarks to Cultures, where he identifies the evolutionary process by which, from the Big Bang to, and he's really big in deep history.
Fab.
Very intelligent guy, super intelligent guy. Probably one of the few guys in my humble judgment, which I consider wise. Uh, so yeah, he would be. I think he would be a dynamite person to interview.
Wonderful. I would love
But
to
I can
speak
put
with
you in
him.
touch.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you for your time today, George. It was brilliant speaking with you.
Well, thank you, and I enjoyed it as well.
If you want to learn more about George's work or read today's interview transcript, I've put links to both in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to this channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. If you loved it, support Planet Critical on Patreon. The link is in the description box below. Supporting the podcast also directly supports my climate corruption investigations, so a huge thank you to the Planet Critical community who make all of this work possible. Thank you all for listening. See you next week.